I want to ask a question about the summit. You said that the American team came in with this proposal of just getting rid of all those nuclear weapons. I mean, who was driving that, and did they? I mean, was it something that they just sort of put out there, thinking that the Soviets would reject it, or what was the game at that point?
Oh. Different people had different games. Bob McFarlane, who was the national security advisor, saw SDI as a bargaining chip, but President Reagan didn't see it as a bargaining chip. He saw it as, for him, the personal answer to the question, how do you build down to zero? You must have, he thought, some way to keep that last weapon or two. So from
But why did the American team come in raising this idea of clearing the board?
The specific idea that they brought in was getting rid of all ballistic missiles. The idea being that the land-based, I should say, ballistic missiles, the idea being that those were the most destabilizing, and so forth.
Those, of course, were also what the Soviet Union had a preponderance of, so I'm sure that was a strategic piece of negotiating on their part.
And that may have been the reason that Gorbachev said, what about the rest of them? And then Reagan takes the leap and says, well, let's get rid of those too. And Gorbachev agrees, and Schultz says, yes, let's do it.
It does appear that the real sticking point for the president was whether or not it was okay just to stick with laboratory scale research for 10 years, which is what they finally came down to on the Soviet side. And at that point, Secretary Weinberger and Richard Pearl, a name which turns up under every rock I've been turning over about this period of time, convinced him that it would kill SDI to confine it to the laboratory. And since he insisted on SDI, that was the end of that event.
Let me ask Stan a question, which is the presidents that you've looked at, do they understand nuclear weapons? Do they understand the plan for their use? Did some of them like them more than other ones? When you were talking about Reagan's, you didn't even want to get briefed on the PSYOP itself and the complexity of it. Kennedy seemed to have to get the notion that, and certainly McNamara, that these were bad things. But did they leave this to the generals?
Spoke of this military-civilian divide here, and certain presidents have been more or less interested. I think Jimmy Carter really immersed himself in what it was, and others seem to be almost oblivious and leave it to the generals, which is both a problem and a potential aid, I think, in getting rid of these things, because the civilians tell the military, well, figure out something to do with it, make a war plan, and the military salutes and goes about its business and makes very elaborate plans, which of course require weapons and is a kind of stimulus and engine for keeping it all going. But when the opportunity presents itself, and I think I disagree a little bit with Jonathan, I think something was done at the end of the Cold War. The stockpile got cut in half. George Herbert Walker Bush got rid of half of the weapons with great ease here in terms of getting rid of all of the Army weapons, Marine Corps, portion of the Navy weapons, and that had to be with the help of the Joint Chiefs. And I think that goes to my point that I was making before, that when confronted with having these things or not, the military, most of the military, it's not universal, many of them are disposed to get rid of them. And when they have an opportunity, they do so. And the history of the stockpile demonstrates that. Now we're down to a kind of a core group. We've called this sort of Cold War light, and it's still a triad, it's still driven by a war plan. And but 15 years after the Cold War, we still have, at the moment, about 10,000. As the Secretary mentioned earlier, that's going to be cut in approximately half again. But still, by the time 2012, we'll still have some 6,000 weapons.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah, but I did want to move on to some other countries as well because of Iran. But yes, please.
Yeah, I think that what surprised me and still surprises me, you're perfectly right, of course, there has been that very happy drop in numbers. And I think that Bush the father tends to get less credit than he should for what he did at that time. Somehow it seems to go rather unnoticed. But what didn't happen was a change in the fundamental framework of nuclear strategy, of deterrence, mutual assured destruction, all the rest of it, that was built up for the Cold War. And then when the political underpinnings of that whole strategy fell away, the strategy somehow survived as if it was good for all seasons and for all countries. And to this day, the Soviet and the, I say Soviet, might as well, because they were Soviet to begin with, but the Russian arsenal and the American exist in a kind of limbo. I have a quote here from the current president: "The era in which the United States and Russia saw each other as a strategic end has ended." Well, they don't see themselves that way anymore. Nevertheless, they're gearing arsenals of thousands of nuclear weapons at one another, still on hair trigger alert, and all the rest of it. So that's the difference I would draw.
Jump in here, because there was something gained with the end of the Cold War. It was not perhaps as obvious as rethinking the plan by the two powers. And that is the delegitimization, really, of these arsenals and of the whole model of mutual assured destruction with the end of the conflict between the two nations. Hans Blix, speaking at Stanford a few months ago, made the wry comment that it looked to him as if the United States was running an arms race with itself these days. And there's a very real sense where that's true. So in the longer run, I think the fact that there's no legitimate purpose for these large MAD sort of programs has its effect on policy, and has its effect, of course, as this conference is looking at, in terms of nuclear proliferation issues. Well, the ambassador's comment, the Egyptian ambassador's comments were, I think, very well taken today about the fact that there is another side to the NPT that has been pervasively neglected and ultimately has to undercut the whole thing if it isn't dealt with.